Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most chaotic and bloody years in all of human history, when four different men claimed to be Emperor of Rome within the span of just 18 months, tearing the greatest empire the world had ever known apart in savage civil wars. Imagine yourself drifting off to a time when legions marched against legions, when the streets of Rome ran red with blood, and when the very survival of civilization hung by a thread as ambitious generals butchered their way to the throne. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. This is the true story of the Year of the Four Emperors, filled with betrayal, suicide, massacre, and shocking twists that would determine the fate of millions across the ancient world. Perhaps you might like to dim the lights and settle comfortably under your blankets as we travel back through time to witness one of history's most dramatic power struggles. Feel the weight of your woolen cloak as we journey to that fateful year of 69 AD, when the Roman world convulsed in agony and ordinary people like yourself faced choices that meant the difference between life and death. The Mediterranean world spreads before you like a vast tapestry of marble cities, golden fields, and bustling harbours. From the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the Rhine's cold waters to the olive groves of North Africa, the Roman Empire encompasses nearly the entire known world. Roads paved with stone stretch like arteries across 3 continents, connecting magnificent cities where aqueducts carry fresh mountain water and amphitheaters echo with the roar of crowds. But beneath this veneer of civilization and order, something is terribly wrong. The air itself seems charged with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm. In the great cities, citizens gather in small groups, whispering nervously about rumors from the capital. In distant provinces, governors weigh their options carefully, knowing that choosing the wrong side in what's coming could mean exile or death. Along the frontiers, battle-hardened legions sharpen their weapons and wonder if they'll soon be marching not against barbarian enemies but against their fellow Romans. The year is 68 AD, and Emperor Nero is dead. The last ruler of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, that golden bloodline that had governed Rome for nearly a century, has perished by his own hand in a squalid farmhouse outside the city walls. With his death, the carefully constructed system of imperial succession has shattered like pottery dropped on stone. There is no clear heir, no obvious candidate to don the purple cloak of absolute power. Into this vacuum step ambitious men from across the empire, each commanding legions, each convinced that destiny calls them to rule. They are generals who have spent decades conquering barbarian tribes and governing distant provinces. They know the taste of victory and the intoxication of command. They have grown accustomed to having thousands of armed men obey their every word. And now, with Rome itself within their grasp, they will not hesitate to drench the empire in blood to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs. You can smell the change in the air, the metallic scent of sharpened steel, the smoke from signal fires carrying urgent messages across hundreds of miles, the dust kicked up by marching columns converging on Italy from every corner of the known world. In taverns and marketplaces, people speak in hushed tones about which legion supports which claimant, about battles fought and emperors murdered, about whether it's safer to flee the cities or to stay and hope for the best. The great machine of Roman government, that marvel of organization that has brought peace and prosperity to millions, is beginning to tear itself apart. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal army, discovers that their loyalty can be bought with gold. The Senate, once the proud voice of Roman aristocracy, cowers behind closed doors, desperately trying to back whichever candidate seems most likely to survive the coming bloodbath. Provincial governors ransack their treasuries to fund private armies, while tax collectors flee their posts rather than face the wrath of whichever faction controls their region. Trade routes that have carried goods safely for generations suddenly become dangerous highways, where merchant caravans risk being robbed by deserting soldiers or pressed into service by passing armies. Cities that have known only peace for decades find themselves choosing between opening their gates to advancing legions or enduring brutal sieges. Temples that have stood for centuries watch nervously as their golden offerings are requisitioned to pay troops whose loyalty shifts with the wind. This is not the ordered, majestic Rome of legend, with its noble senators debating philosophy and its disciplined legions extending civilization to grateful barbarians. This is Rome with its mask torn away, revealing the brutal ambition and naked power that have always lurked beneath the surface of its marble facades and high-minded rhetoric. This is an empire where the difference between emperor and usurper depends entirely on who can command the most swords, where loyalty is a commodity bought and sold in bags of gold coins, where today's hero becomes tomorrow's traitor's corpse. The 4 men who will claim the throne are already in motion, though they may not yet realize it. In Spain, an aging general named Servius Sulpicius Galba drills his legions and counts his supporters. In Portugal, Marcus Salvius Otho harbors bitter resentments and dreams of revenge. Along the Rhine frontier, Aulus Vitellius commands some of the empire's finest soldiers and has grown accustomed to their adulation. And in distant Judea, Titus Flavius Vespasianus methodically crushes a Jewish rebellion while his agents whisper of greater opportunities. Within 18 months, all 4 of these men will wear the purple. 2 will die by their own hand rather than face capture. 1 will be dragged through the streets of Rome and butchered like an animal. Only 1 will survive to found a new dynasty and restore the empire's stability. But the cost of this survival will be measured in tens of thousands of lives, in cities burned and provinces devastated, in the shattering of the myth that Rome is eternal and invincible. As darkness settles over the Mediterranean world like a shroud, you prepare to witness the year when the Roman Empire nearly destroyed itself, when civilization itself hung in the balance, and when your very survival would depend on choosing the right side in a conflict where mercy was rare and mistakes were fatal. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the Roman Empire in the early months of 69 AD, and you find yourself standing in the Forum Roman on a crisp January morning as the first pale light of dawn touches the marble columns around you. The good news is that you're a citizen of the most powerful civilization on Earth, living in the greatest city ever built by human hands, surrounded by architectural marvels that showcase centuries of conquest and wealth. The bad news? Well, you're about to witness the most violent and chaotic year in Roman history, and your chances of surviving it intact depend entirely on making the right choices at exactly the right moments. You're a middle-class Roman citizen, perhaps a merchant dealing in imported silks from the East, or a skilled craftsman who makes bronze fittings for wealthy households, or maybe a clerk in one of the many government offices that keep the empire running. You own a modest house in the Suburba district, not far from where Julius Caesar once lived before he became dictator. You have enough money to afford decent food and wine, a slave or 2 to help with household tasks, and the occasional visit to the baths or the theatre. Until now, your biggest worry has been whether grain prices might rise or whether your business rivals might undercut your contracts with important clients. But everything changed 3 weeks ago when the impossible happened. Emperor Galba, the stern old general who had marched from Spain to claim the throne after Nero's suicide, was butchered right here in the Forum by his own Praetorian guards. You remember that terrible morning, the screams echoing off the ancient stones, the spray of blood across the steps of the Temple of Vesta. The sight of Rome's most powerful man dying like a common criminal while his would-be heir Piso was hunted down and killed nearby. The new emperor, Marcus Salvius Otho, seems pleasant enough when he addresses the crowds from the rostra, the speaker's platform where Cicero once delivered his greatest speeches. He promises stability, prosperity, and respect for Roman traditions. He pays the Praetorian guards generously and makes sure the grain shipments from Egypt continue to arrive on schedule. For a few precious days, it almost feels like the nightmare might be over, like Rome might return to the peaceful prosperity it knew under earlier emperors. But you've started to notice troubling signs that make your stomach clench with anxiety. Late at night, you can hear the sound of marching feet on the cobblestones outside your window, not the measured tread of the city watch making their rounds, but the urgent pace of soldiers preparing for war. Your neighbor, who works as a scribe in the treasury, whispers that massive sums of gold are being withdrawn to pay troops whose loyalty cannot be taken for granted. Your wine merchant, a garrulous man who normally loves to gossip about everything from chariot races to political scandals, has grown unusually quiet and keeps glancing nervously toward the doors of his shop. Most disturbing of all are the refugees beginning to trickle into the city from the north. They arrive with haunted eyes and few possessions, speaking in hushed tones about armies gathering in Germania, about a general named Vitellius who commands the loyalty of the Rhine legions, some of the finest soldiers in the entire empire. These aren't barbarian tribesmen or bandits, they say. These are Roman legions, the same disciplined formations that conquered Gaul and Britain, and they're marching south toward Italy with grim determination. You try to go about your normal business, but everything feels different now. The morning ritual of visiting the baths becomes an exercise in reading faces and listening to whispered conversations. Who supports Otho? Who might secretly favor this Vitellius? Which of your clients might be hedging their bets by sending messages to both sides? In the markets, prices fluctuate wildly as merchants try to guess whether it's better to hoard goods or sell them quickly before chaos erupts. The temples are crowded now with people making offerings and seeking divine guidance. You find yourself joining them, placing a handful of coins before the statue of Fortuna and muttering prayers for protection and wisdom. The priests speak cryptically about omens and portents, eagles fighting in the sky above the Palatine Hill, springs running red in distant provinces, strange dreams troubling the sleep of important officials. Your wife has started suggesting that perhaps you should visit her relatives in Neapolis, the Greek city far to the south where your brother-in-law owns a pottery workshop. It would be a temporary retreat, she insists, just until the political situation clarifies itself. But you know, as she knows, that if you flee Rome now, you might return to find your property confiscated, your business destroyed, your position in society permanently compromised. In a world where personal relationships and reputation mean everything, abandoning the capital during a crisis could mark you as a coward or a traitor. Yet staying carries its own terrible risks. You've heard stories from the civil wars of the late Republic, when Marius and Sulla turned Rome into a slaughterhouse, when proscription lists posted in the Forum condemned thousands of citizens to death, when neighbors denounced neighbors and fortunes built over generations disappeared overnight. Those conflicts happened over a century ago, but the old families still speak of them in hushed tones, still remember which ancestors chose wisely, and which paid the ultimate price for backing the wrong faction. The weight of decision presses down on you like a physical burden. Every conversation could be a test of your loyalty. Every business transaction might be interpreted as political support. Every casual remark about the weather or the grain supply could be twisted into evidence of treason or sedition. You're discovering that in times of civil war there are no neutral parties, no safe havens for those who simply want to live quiet lives and pursue their modest ambitions. As you stand in your doorway this January morning, watching the early crowds beginning to fill the streets of Rome, you realize with growing dread that you're no longer just a spectator to history. You've become a participant in events that will determine not only your own fate, but the destiny of the entire known world. The year of the four emperors has begun, and your survival now depends on navigating the treacherous currents of ambition, betrayal and violence that are about to engulf the eternal city. It's March now, and the warming spring air carries more than just the scent of blooming flowers through the streets of Rome. You can smell fear, sharp and metallic like the edge of a freshly sharpened sword. The news has arrived from the north that changes everything, delivered by a dust-covered courier who rode his horse nearly to death to reach the capital. Aulus Vitellius, the corpulent governor of Lower Germany, has been proclaimed emperor by his legions, and they're already crossing the Alps into northern Italy. You witness the moment when Emperor Otho receives this devastating intelligence, standing among the crowd gathered in the forum as a herald reads the official dispatch. The words echo off the marble columns with the finality of a death sentence. The armies of Germania Superior and Germania Inferior, 8 full legions totaling nearly 50,000 men, plus auxiliaries, have declared their loyalty to Aulus Vitellius Germanicus Augustus. They have departed their winter quarters and are advancing south through Gaul toward the Alpine passes. The silence that follows is more terrifying than any scream. You watch Otho's face drain of color as the implications sink in. These aren't rebellious provincial militia or hastily recruited barbarian mercenaries. These are the Rhine legions, the finest soldiers in the empire, hardened by decades of warfare against Germanic tribes, loyal to commanders who have led them to countless victories. They know how to fight, how to march, and most importantly, how to win. How long? Otho asks, his voice barely carrying across the forum despite the absolute quiet. They should reach the Pol Valley within the month. Caesar, the messenger replies, using the title that Otho has claimed but which sounds increasingly hollow with each passing moment. You feel the crowd around you begin to shift and murmur as people process what they've just heard. A month. 4 weeks for Rome to prepare for a war that will determine whether Otho continues to rule or whether his 3-month reign ends in violence and disgrace. You catch fragments of whispered conversations, heard Vitellius promises his soldiers bonuses worth 3 years' pay. My cousin in Mediolanum says they're already requisitioning supplies. The 13th Legion marched through his town yesterday. Looked like they meant business. But it's not just the military threat that chills your blood. It's what you see in the faces around you. The calculations, the hedged bets, the opportunistic gleam in eyes that are already weighing which side to support. Rome has been through this before, during the civil wars that destroyed the Republic, and the older citizens remember the stories their grandfathers told about neighbors turning against neighbors, about fortunes confiscated and families destroyed by backing the wrong faction. Later that evening, you find yourself in the Sabora Tavern, where you often meet with other merchants and craftsmen to discuss business and politics. The atmosphere is electric with tension and possibility. Marcus Tertius, a wine importer who usually keeps his political opinions to himself, leans forward conspiratorially. My brother-in-law works in the Praetorian camp, he whispers. Says the guards are already grumbling about having to fight real legions instead of ceremonial duties. Half of them have never seen actual combat. Gaius Flavius, An elderly silversmith whose family has lived in Rome for 6 generations shakes his grizzled head grimly. I was a boy during Claudius's reign, but I remember the stories from my father's time. He lived through the civil wars after Julius Caesar's death. Said the worst part wasn't the battles. It was never knowing who you could trust. Never knowing if the person sitting next to you might denounce you to save their own skin. What do we know about this Vitellius? Asks Lucius Cassius, a fabric merchant who supplies several wealthy households. Is he another Galba, all stern discipline and no mercy? Or might he be reasonable with those who supported Otho out of necessity rather than conviction? The question hangs in the smoky air like an omen. None of you have ever seen Vitellius, never heard him speak, never witnessed how he treats enemies or rewards friends. Yet your lives, your family's futures, your very survival may depend on guessing correctly about his character and intentions. An older man at the corner table, someone you recognize but don't know well, speaks up in a voice roughened by years of wine and worry. I fought in Britain under Vespasianus 30 years ago, knew plenty of officers who served with Vitellius in Germania. They say he's soft, enjoys his comforts, loves his food and wine, lets his subordinates handle the difficult decisions. But the men like him because he doesn't demand too much of them. And the junior officers like him because he doesn't interfere with their advancement. Soft can be good for us, Marcus Tertius suggests hopefully. Soft might mean he's willing to negotiate, to forgive those who simply went along with Otho because that's who happened to be emperor when they arrived in Rome. But Gaius Flavius looks skeptical. Soft can also mean weak. And weak emperors surrounded by ambitious subordinates often end up being more dangerous than strong ones, because you never know who's really making the decisions. At least when you're dealing with a tyrant, you know the tyrant is in charge. As the night deepens and more wine flows, the conversation becomes increasingly desperate and calculating. Should those with money try to flee Rome before the fighting begins? Should they attempt to send messages to Vitellius's agents, declaring their willingness to support the new regime? Should they liquidate their assets and hide gold coins in secret caches, preparing for the chaos that always accompanies changes of power? You realize with growing horror that you're not just discussing politics anymore. You're planning for survival in a world where the wrong choice, the wrong word, even the wrong expression on your face at the wrong moment could mean death, exile, or financial ruin. The comfortable, predictable life you've known is evaporating like morning mist, replaced by a harsh reality where ordinary citizens become pawns in the ambitions of powerful men. Walking home through the darkened streets, you pass the Praetorian camp and hear the sounds of frantic activity, shouted orders, the clatter of weapons being cleaned and sharpened, the rumble of supply wagons being loaded. Rome is preparing for war, but it's a strange, desperate kind of preparation. This isn't the confident mobilization of a secure empire marching against barbarian enemies. This is the panicked improvisation of a government that suddenly realizes it might not survive the next few weeks. The realization hits you like a physical blow as you reach your own door. There's no safe choice anymore. Supporting Otho means risking everything on an inexperienced emperor and an untested army. But supporting Vitellius means betraying the man who currently controls Rome. The man whose agents could have you arrested and executed before Vitellius's legions ever reach the city walls, and trying to remain neutral. In civil war, neutrality is often seen as cowardice by both sides, and cowards rarely survive. The morning brings devastating clarity as you make your way through the bustling streets to conduct what might be your final business transactions in a peaceful Rome. Today, you've decided to seek out those who knew these men before they became emperors, to understand the human hearts beating beneath the purple cloaks and golden laurel wreaths. Your survival may depend on comprehending not just their military capabilities, but their deepest motivations, their fears, and their dreams of glory. Your first stop is the villa of Senator Lucius Caecilius Marcellus, an elderly patrician whose family has served Rome for generations and who knew both Otho and Galba personally. You find him in his garden, pruning roses with the careful attention of a man seeking distraction from weightier matters. His lined face bears the melancholy of someone who has witnessed too many promising careers end in violence and disgrace. You want to understand Otho, he says, setting down his pruning shears and gazing toward the Palatine Hill where the imperial palace gleams in the morning sun. Then you must understand that everything he does springs from a wound that has never healed. 30 years ago he was Nero's closest friend, his partner in midnight revelries through the streets of Rome. They were young men drunk on power and possibility, believing themselves above the ordinary constraints that govern lesser mortals. The old senator's voice grows bitter as he continues. But then Nero fell in love with Otho's wife, the beautiful Poppaea Sabina. Not content with simply taking her as a mistress, Nero forced Otho to divorce her so that the emperor could make her his own bride. Imagine the humiliation, to have your closest friend steal not just your wife, but your entire future happiness, and to be powerless to resist because he holds the power of life and death over you. You can almost see it in your mind's eye. The young Otho, proud and ambitious, watching helplessly as his world crumbled at the whim of an imperial friend who had grown tired of sharing anything with anyone. Otho spent 10 years in exile in Lusitania, governing a province far from Rome, nursing his resentment like a sacred flame. Every dawn he awoke remembering his humiliation. Every sunset he dreamed of the day when he might have his revenge. And now he has it, you observe quietly. Indeed, but revenge is a cold companion when you're trying to govern an empire. Otho has spent so many years focused on what was taken from him that he's never developed a clear vision of what he wants to build. He knows he doesn't want to be humiliated again, doesn't want to be anyone's subordinate or victim. But beyond that, the senator shrugs eloquently. He's discovering that hatred is easier to maintain than hope. From the senator's villa, you make your way to a different part of the city, to a tavern near the Campus Martius, where veterans gather to drink wine and relive their glory days. Here you find Gaius Fabius Valens, a grizzled former centurion who served under Vitellius during the German campaigns. His weathered hands gesture enthusiastically as he describes his former commander to a small group of fascinated listeners. "You have to understand," Valens says, his voice carrying the authority of a man who has faced Germanic warriors in battle. "Vitellius isn't like the other ambitious generals you hear about. He doesn't pace around his tent at night plotting grand strategies or dreaming of conquering distant lands. He's comfortable, content even. He genuinely enjoys the simple pleasures, a good meal, a fine vintage wine, the company of friends who share amusing stories." Another veteran, a Gallic auxiliary with a scar across his cheek, nods agreement. "I remember the winter we were besieging that Batavian fortress on the Rhine. Most commanders would have driven us hard, demanded discipline and sacrifice. Vitellius, he organized feast days, made sure the wine rations were generous, told jokes around the campfires. The men would have followed him into Hades because he treated them like human beings rather than military assets." But there's something troubling in the way Valens continues his description. The thing is, Vitellius never actually sought this power. The legions proclaimed him emperor while he was still sleeping off a particularly festive evening. He woke up to find purple robes laid out for him, and 50,000 soldiers demanding that he march on Rome. What do you do when refusing might mean mutiny, and accepting might mean civil war? So he's reluctant, you ask? Not reluctant exactly. Valens clarifies, choosing his words carefully. More like fatalistic. He believes the gods have pushed him into this position, so he'll play the role they've assigned. But he's also terrified of making the kinds of hard decisions that real leadership requires. He'd rather delegate authority to his subordinates and hope they make wise choices. The implications chill your blood. A reluctant emperor commanded by ambitious subordinates is often more dangerous than a tyrant, because you never know who is really making the decisions that will determine your fate. Later that afternoon you visit the shop of Helena Marcella, a wine merchant whose trade connections span the entire Mediterranean. She has clients among the wealthy families who receive letters from every corner of the empire, and her informal network of information rivals that of many government officials. Everyone focuses on the generals, she says, weighing silver coins with practiced efficiency, but they forget about the women who influenced them. Galba never married again after his wife died young. Some say that's why he grew so rigid and unforgiving, lacking the softening influence that a good marriage provides. Otho's obsession with Poppea consumed him so completely that he's never formed deep bonds with anyone since. He trusts no one, loves no one, believes in nothing except his own wounded pride. She pauses to serve another customer, then continues in a lower voice. But Vitellius, his wife Galeria Fundana, is said to be a remarkable woman, intelligent, practical, devoted to her family. She reportedly begged him not to accept the imperial acclamation, knowing it would bring nothing but bloodshed and sorrow. They say he agreed to march on Rome partly because his subordinates convinced him that rejecting the purple would mean death for his entire family. And what of his children, you ask? A son and daughter, both still young. The boy, Germanicus, is about 12 years old enough to understand that his father's decisions will determine whether he grows up as an imperial prince or dies as a traitor's child. Imagine carrying that burden, knowing that your father's political choices may cost you everything, including your life. As evening approaches and you make your way home through streets now noticeably emptier than usual, you reflect on what you've learned. These aren't monsters or demigods struggling for cosmic dominion. They're men with human weaknesses and understandable motivations. Otho seeks vindication for old wounds. Vitellius stumbles forward reluctantly, driven by circumstances rather than ambition. Both are probably decent enough people in their private moments, capable of kindness and loyalty within their personal circles. But that knowledge makes the situation more terrifying, not less. History is shaped not by evil masterminds with grand designs, but by ordinary people making desperate choices under impossible circumstances. Good men can become tyrants when they're frightened. Kind men can order massacres when they're convinced their survival depends on ruthlessness. And decent men can destroy everything they claim to love when they're trapped in situations where every option leads to tragedy. Tomorrow, you know, the real decisions will begin. Otho will have to choose between attempting negotiation or preparing for war. Vitellius will have to decide whether to march directly on Rome or establish a power base in northern Italy. And you, along with millions of other ordinary citizens, will have to choose which side offers the better chance of survival in a conflict where the stakes couldn't be higher and the outcome couldn't be less certain. The illusion of normalcy shatters completely on a grey April morning. When the first concrete signs of approaching war reach the capital, you're in the forum conducting business when a commotion erupts near the rostra. A travel-stained messenger has arrived from the north, and the news he carries spreads through the crowd like fire through dry wheat. Placentia has fallen to Vitellius, the man announces, his voice hoarse from hard riding. The garrison surrendered without a fight. His advance guard is already crossing the Pop River. The implications hit you like a physical blow. Placentia, modern-day Piacenza, sits barely 200 miles from Rome. At the pace a determined army can march, that means Vitellius's forces could reach the capital within 2 weeks. But more disturbing than the distance is what the messenger reveals about the manner of the city's surrender. Standing among the growing crowd, you listen as an elderly senator questions the messenger. You say they surrendered without resistance. What of their loyalty oath to Emperor Otho? The messenger's expression grows uncomfortable. Senator, the garrison commander said his men saw no point in dying for an emperor they barely knew when Vitellius's soldiers promised them generous terms for switching sides. They opened the gates at dawn and formally transferred their allegiance. A chill runs through the assembled crowd. This isn't conquest through military superiority. It's defection born of calculation and opportunism. If seasoned Roman soldiers can abandon their sworn loyalty so easily, what does that say about the stability of Otho's regime? You notice how the news affects different people in different ways. The wealthy merchants and senators look increasingly nervous, calculating how quickly they might need to liquidate assets or flee the city. The common citizens seem more resigned than afraid. For them, one emperor is much like another as long as the grain shipments continue and their neighborhoods remain safe. But the soldiers visible in the crowd, particularly the Praetorian guards, display a mixture of anger and unease that speaks to deeper concerns about their professional honor and personal safety. Later that morning, you witness a scene that reveals just how rapidly the situation is deteriorating. Outside the Senate House, you observe a heated conversation between two prominent Romans, Marcus Cluvius Rufus, a historian and senator, and Gaius Licinius Mucianus, a wealthy patrician with connections to the eastern provinces. The emperor is making a critical mistake, Mucianus says, his voice barely controlled. He's treating this as a military problem that can be solved by gathering enough soldiers and marching north. But this is fundamentally a political crisis. Half the empire doesn't even know who Otho is, and the other half remembers him as Nero's dissolute companion. Rufus nods grimly. I've been in Rome for 60 years, lived through 4 emperors before this crisis began. I've never seen legitimacy evaporate so quickly. When Claudius died and Nero took power, there was at least the fiction of dynastic succession. When Nero fell and Galba claimed the throne, he had the support of respected generals and provincial governors. But Otho, his primary qualification seems to be that he successfully murdered his predecessor. And now Vitellius approaches with the same logic. Mucianus continues. His qualification is that he commands more legions than Otho. If that becomes the standard for imperial succession, we'll have civil war every time an ambitious general decides he deserves a promotion. You realize you're witnessing something unprecedented in Roman history, the complete breakdown of any systematic method for transferring power. The Julio-Claudian dynasty provided stability for nearly a century because everyone understood the rules of succession, however imperfect they might have been. But now, with those rules shattered, raw military force has become the only currency that matters. The afternoon brings more disturbing news from multiple sources. Refugees arriving from the north describe a strange kind of warfare, one where battles are won and lost through negotiation rather than combat. Vitellius's generals aren't simply conquering cities, they're convincing them to surrender by offering better terms than Otho can match. At a wine shop near the Circus Maximus, you overhear a conversation between 2 merchants who have just returned from business trips to northern Italy. Their account chills your blood. It's not like any war I've ever heard of, one explains. Vitellius's men arrive outside a city and immediately send envoys to negotiate with the local commanders. They offer promotions, bonuses, land grants, anything to avoid actual fighting. And it's working because Otho's representatives can't make competing offers. How can they promise rewards when everyone knows the imperial treasury is nearly empty? His companion nods nervously. My brother-in-law commands an auxiliary unit stationed near Mediolanum. Says the men talk openly about switching sides if Vitellius's agents approach them. They're not traitors exactly. They're businessmen making practical decisions about their careers and their families' futures. That evening you attend what may be your last normal dinner party for months or years to come. Your host, Lucius Antonius Saturninus, is a wealthy textile merchant whose clients include several senatorial families. The conversation revolves entirely around survival strategies and escape plans. I've already moved most of my gold to properties outside Italy, Saturninus confides. If Rome falls, I want assets that Vitellius can't easily confiscate. And I've prepared letters of introduction to merchants in Alexandria and Athens, just in case exile becomes necessary. Another guest, a jeweler named Gaius Valerius Maximus, reveals his own preparations. I've been converting everything possible into portable valuables, gems, rare coins, items that hold their value regardless of which emperor claims the throne. And I've established relationships with ship captains who ask no questions about passengers seeking urgent transport to distant ports. But perhaps the most chilling revelation comes from Marcus Junius Brutus, a distant descendant of Caesar's assassin, who works as a clerk in the imperial administration. The palace is in complete chaos. Officials are destroying documents that might compromise them with a new regime. Treasury records are being altered to hide evidence of corruption or mismanagement. And there are rumors that some of Otho's closest advisors are already sending secret messages to Vitellius, positioning themselves for the transition. As you walk home through streets that seem increasingly empty and ominous, you understand that you're witnessing the collapse not just of a government, but of the entire social contract that holds civilization together. When loyalty becomes a luxury that few can afford, when pragmatic betrayal offers better survival prospects than principled steadfastness, when the machinery of state dissolves into competing conspiracies, ordinary citizens are left to navigate a world where today's protector may become tomorrow's executioner. The decisive moment arrives on April 14, 69 AD, with the kind of mundane morning that history often chooses for its most dramatic turning points. You wake to the sound of rain pattering against your window shutters, and for a brief moment, you can almost pretend this is just another ordinary spring day in the eternal city. Then you hear the distant sound of trumpets, not the familiar calls that mark the changing of the guard, but the urgent, discordant blasts that signal military emergency. By the time you reach the forum, the news has already arrived, carried by riders who killed their horses getting to Rome ahead of anyone else. The words echo from mouth to mouth with the finality of a funeral bell, Bedriacum. Otho is defeated. The emperor is dead. You stand among hundreds of other stunned Romans as an official herald climbs onto the rostra to make the announcement that will change everything. His voice shakes, whether from exhaustion, fear, or grief, you cannot tell. Citizens of Rome, he begins, his words carrying across the suddenly silent square, I bring news from the north. Yesterday the armies of Emperor Otho met the forces of the usurper Vitellius near the village of Bedriacum, some 20 miles from Cremona. Despite the courage of our soldiers and the wisdom of our commanders, the day went against us. The crowd remains eerily quiet, as if no one wants to hear what comes next. The Praetorian cohorts fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers. The first Adutrix legion held their position until their commander fell. But when the German auxiliaries flanked our left wing, our line began to collapse. You can picture it in your mind. Roman soldiers, men who had conquered Britain and subdued Gaul, turning their weapons against each other in the muddy fields of northern Italy. Brothers in arms becoming mortal enemies because their loyalty belonged to different claimants to the purple. Emperor Otho, learning of the defeat, chose the path of honor rather than prolong the bloodshed that was tearing our empire apart. This morning, in his tent at Brixellum, he took his own life with a dagger thrust to the heart. His final words were recorded by his secretary: "I will not be the cause of further civil war. Let Vitellius rule, and let Rome have peace." The silence that follows is more profound than any scream. You watch the faces around you, seeing the rapid calculations taking place behind their eyes. Otho is dead. Vitellius has won. Within days, possibly hours, the city will have a new master. Everyone who supported Otho, everyone who served his administration, everyone who profited from his brief reign now faces an uncertain and potentially deadly future. But what strikes you most powerfully is not the political implications, but the human tragedy of it all. 3 months ago, Otho was simply another Roman senator, probably looking forward to a comfortable retirement managing his estates, and perhaps writing memoirs of his time in Lusitania. Today he lies dead in a military tent, having gambled everything on one battle, and lost not just his life, but his place in history. An old woman standing near you begins to weep, not for Otho specifically, but for what his death represents. "My grandson serves with the auxiliary cavalry," she whispers to her companion. "Was he at this battle? Is he dead? Wounded? Will he even be allowed to come home, or will Vitellius punish anyone who fought for the wrong emperor?" Her words capture what everyone is thinking, but few dare voice. The Battle of Bedriacum wasn't just a military defeat, it was a human catastrophe that destroyed thousands of families and shattered countless lives. Every soldier who died left behind parents, wives, children. Every officer who fell represented years of training and experience that the empire could ill afford to lose, and the survivors. They now face the terrible choice between swearing loyalty to the man they were trying to kill yesterday, or facing execution as traitors. Throughout the morning, more details filter back to Rome, each one adding to the picture of disaster. The casualty reports are staggering, not just from the battle itself, but from the subsequent pursuit as Vitellius's cavalry hunted down fleeing remnants of Otho's army. Entire cohorts have been wiped out. Elite units that trace their lineage back to Julius Caesar have simply ceased to exist. By midday, the practical consequences begin to manifest. Government offices throughout the city shut their doors as officials flee or go into hiding. The Praetorian camp empties as guardsmen abandon their posts, stripping off their distinctive armor and melting into the civilian population. Treasury officials work frantically to hide or destroy records that might implicate them in Otho's administration. In the markets, panic buying begins as people realize that the transition period between emperors might disrupt food supplies or currency values. Gold and silver change hands at premium prices as those with portable wealth try to prepare for an uncertain future. Ships in the harbor are booked solid as wealthy families arrange to leave Italy until the political situation stabilizes. But perhaps the most telling sign of how completely the old order has collapsed comes when you witness a group of senators meeting quietly in a private villa, arguing about whether they should send an embassy to Vitellius offering Rome's submission or wait for him to arrive and demand their surrender personally. "If we go to him," argues one elderly patrician, "we look weak and desperate. But if we wait here, we risk being seen as defiant or disloyal. Either choice could be fatal." "The real question," responds another senator, "is whether Vitellius will honor traditional immunities. Will he respect the dignity of the Senate, or will he follow the example of Sulla and proscribe anyone who might threaten his position?" As evening falls over a city that has fundamentally changed since morning, you realize that you've witnessed one of those pivotal moments when history turns on its axis. The Roman Empire woke up with one emperor and went to sleep preparing to receive another. But more than that, the entire basis of imperial legitimacy has shifted. Vitellius will rule not because of birth, adoption, or even Senate approval, but because he commanded the largest army and used it most effectively. This precedent, that military strength alone determines who wears the purple, will echo through the centuries to come, making the empire perpetually vulnerable to ambitious generals who believe they can do better than the current occupant of the throne. The year of the four emperors is far from over, and the lessons learned at Bedricum will shape every subsequent struggle for power. The transition happens faster than anyone expected. Within 3 days of receiving news of Otho's defeat, Rome begins to transform itself from a city that never knew Vitellius existed into one that has always supported him. You watch this remarkable metamorphosis with the fascination of someone witnessing a master illusionist at work. Now you see imperial legitimacy, now you don't, now you see it again under a completely different guise. The first sign comes when the Senate hastily convenes in an emergency session. You manage to position yourself outside the Curia Julia, where you can hear fragments of the debate through the partially open doors. The voices inside reflect a mixture of desperation, calculation, and pragmatic acceptance of reality. "We must send an embassy immediately," declares Senator Gaius Helvidius Priscus, his voice carrying the authority of advanced age. "Every hour we delay in recognizing Vitellius as our legitimate emperor is another hour he might interpret as defiance or resistance." But another voice, younger and more defiant, responds with bitter sarcasm, "Legitimate. 3 months ago we acclaimed Otho as our savior from Galba's tyranny. Now we're expected to embrace the man who just destroyed our savior. What happens when the next ambitious general decides that Vitellius has outlived his usefulness?" The older senator's reply cuts through the chamber like a blade. "What happens, young colleague, is that we survive." Dead senators make no speeches about political consistency. By evening, the decision is made. A delegation of Rome's most distinguished citizens will travel north to meet Vitellius and formally invite him to accept the imperial title that everyone knows he's already claimed. The delegation includes former consuls, respected jurists, and representatives of the major priestly colleges, all the symbolic authority that Roman tradition can muster, deployed in service of making an accomplished fact appear to be a legitimate choice. You decide to follow this embassy, partly out of curiosity about the man who will now rule your world, partly because staying in Rome feels increasingly dangerous as various factions begin settling scores and positioning themselves for the new regime. The journey north takes you through landscapes that bear the scars of recent warfare: burned farms, abandoned villages, roads clogged with refugees moving in both directions as people try to guess which areas will be safe under the new emperor. Near Titanum, you encounter your first glimpse of Vitellius's army, and the sight both impresses and disturbs you. These are professional soldiers, their equipment well maintained, their formations disciplined, their confidence evident in the easy way they occupy the territory they've conquered. But there's something unsettling about their casual assumption of superiority, the way they regard Italian civilians as a conquered people rather than fellow citizens of the empire they claim to serve. A Germanic auxiliary with ritual scars on his cheeks and arms thick as tree trunks examines your travel documents with barely concealed contempt. Another Roman merchant, he says to his companion in accented Latin. They all look the same: soft hands, worried faces, purses full of gold they hope will buy them safety. His companion, a Batavian with a braided beard, laughs roughly. Give them time. They'll learn to appreciate proper leadership instead of the weaklings they've been following. Emperor Vitellius knows how to reward loyalty and punish treachery. The implication is unmistakable. The new regime views Romans not as citizens to be governed, but as subjects to be controlled. This army sees itself as an occupying force bringing civilization to inferior peoples, which creates a fundamental tension in the nature of Roman imperial authority. How can an empire maintain legitimacy when its own soldiers regard its heartland as conquered territory? You reach Vitellius's camp outside Mediolanum on a warm spring afternoon when the new emperor is receiving local delegations. Your first sight of him confirms much of what you'd heard. He's a large man, not fat exactly, but substantial in the way that suggests a comfortable relationship with food and wine. His manner with the suppliant Italians is genial but distant, like a benevolent but busy landowner dealing with his estate managers. "Citizens of Mediolanum," he says, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, "your loyalty during these recent difficulties has been noted and appreciated. Those communities that supported the rightful imperial authority will find their faithfulness rewarded. Those that chose, unwisely, will have opportunities to demonstrate their reformed commitment to proper governance." The speech is skillfully crafted, generous enough to offer hope, vague enough to avoid specific commitments, and threatening enough to discourage any thoughts of resistance. But what strikes you most is how thoroughly Vitellius has already absorbed the role of emperor. There's no uncertainty in his manner, no acknowledgement that his claim to power rests entirely on military victory rather than legal succession. When the Roman senatorial delegation arrives the following morning, you witness a carefully choreographed performance of legitimacy. The senators prostrate themselves before Vitellius, formally offering him the imperial titles and powers. He accepts with apparent reluctance, as if the burden of ruling the known world is being thrust upon him rather than something he has fought to obtain. "If the Senate and people of Rome believe that I can serve the empire's needs in these troubled times," he declares, "then I will accept this responsibility, however heavy it may prove. My only desire is to restore the peace and prosperity that our citizens deserve after the chaos of recent months." The irony is breathtaking. The man who has just spent 3 months marching his armies across half of Europe to seize power by force now presents himself as a reluctant servant of the public good. Yet the senators nod and applaud as if this fiction represents obvious truth rather than transparent theatre. But perhaps the most revealing moment comes during the private feast that evening, when you overhear a conversation between Vitellius and one of his German commanders. The general, a scarred veteran named Arminius, speaks with the casual brutality of someone accustomed to solving problems through violence. "Caesar," he says, using the title that Vitellius has formally accepted, "what do you want done about the officers who served Otho, and the Praetorian guards who killed Galba? Some of my men are eager for justice." Vitellius considers this while tearing apart a roasted fowl with his bare hands. "No massacres," he finally replies. "We're not barbarians conquering a foreign city. We're Romans restoring order to our own empire. Punish the ringleaders if you must, but quietly. I want gratitude, not terror." It's a pragmatic decision that reveals both Vitellius's political intelligence and the constraints he faces. He needs to satisfy his soldiers' desire for revenge while avoiding the kind of bloodbath that would make his rule permanently unstable. But you can see in Arminius's expression that not all of the new emperor's supporters are equally committed to restraint. The summer of 69 AD unfolds with a deceptive tranquility that reminds you of the calm before thunderstorms. Vitellius enters Rome in July with all the pageantry the city can muster: triumphal processions, gladiatorial games, lavish banquets that stretch for days. For a few precious weeks it almost feels as if the nightmare of civil war has ended, as if the empire has finally found stability under its new ruler. But beneath the marble facades and golden celebrations you sense something ominous gathering strength, like storm clouds building on a distant horizon. Your first hint that all is not well comes during a conversation at the baths with Marcus Flavius Cerealis, a retired centurion who served 30 years on the eastern frontier. His weathered hands gesture toward the east as he speaks in the low, urgent tones of a man sharing dangerous secrets. "I've been getting letters from my old unit stationed in Judea," he murmurs, glancing around to ensure no one else is listening. "They say General Vespasian has been asking strange questions about troop strengths in other provinces, about the loyalty of various commanders, about how much gold it would take to transport an army from Palestine to Rome. The implications make your blood run cold. Vespasian, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, is one of Rome's most respected generals, currently engaged in crushing the Jewish rebellion that has dragged on for 3 years. If he's contemplating a bid for imperial power, it would mean the year of the 4 emperors is far from over. But surely he wouldn't dare," you protest, though even as you speak the words, you realize how naive they sound. Vitellius has just consolidated his position. The Rhine legions are unbeaten. The people are weary of civil war. Cerealis gives you a look of pitying condescension. "Son, you're thinking like a civilian. Vespasian commands 3 full legions in Judea, plus auxiliaries. He has the support of the eastern provinces, which are the richest in the empire, and most importantly, he has something Vitellius lacks, a reputation for competence and restraint." Over the following weeks, more disturbing intelligence filters back to Rome through various channels. Egyptian grain merchants report unusual military activity around Alexandria. Traders from Syria mention that Governor Gaius Licinius Mucianus has been meeting privately with various commanders. Most ominously, the flow of tax revenue from the eastern provinces has begun to slow, as if local officials are hedging their bets about which emperor to support. You witness Vitellius's response to these threats during a Senate meeting where the emperor addresses concerns about eastern loyalty. Standing on the rostrum where Cicero once delivered his greatest speeches, Vitellius displays a combination of bluster and genuine bewilderment that suggests he doesn't fully comprehend the magnitude of the challenge he faces. "Senators," he declares, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "we have received reports of minor disturbances in some eastern provinces. This is nothing more than the usual complaints from tax collectors and the ambitious dreams of provincial commanders who have spent too long away from civilized society. A few letters expressing our displeasure should suffice to restore proper order." But you notice that several senators exchange meaningful glances, and after the session ends you overhear fragments of private conversations that reveal deep skepticism about the emperor's assessment. "He doesn't understand," whispers Gaius Asinius Pollio to his companion as they walk past you in the forum. "Vespasian isn't some barbarian chieftain who can be intimidated with threatening messages. He's been governing provinces and commanding legions since before Nero took the throne. If he's moving against Vitellius, it's because he believes he can win." The situation deteriorates rapidly in late summer when definitive news arrives from the east. On July 1st, the legions in Egypt proclaimed Vespasian emperor. Within days, the entire eastern Mediterranean followed suit. Syria, Judea, even parts of Asia Minor. What had been whispered rumors suddenly became open rebellion encompassing nearly half the empire's wealth and military strength. You're present in the imperial palace when Vitellius receives the formal notification of Vespasian's claim to the throne. The messenger, a travel-stained courier who has ridden across most of the known world to deliver his dispatch, kneels before the emperor with the elaborate deference that protocol demands, but which somehow seems mocking under the circumstances. "Divine Caesar," the man says, his voice carefully neutral, "I bring word from Governor Vespasian in Judea. He wishes me to inform you that the eastern provinces have unanimously requested his leadership during these troubling times. He regrets the necessity of this action, but feels compelled by duty to accept their entreaties for the good of the empire." The silence that follows stretches like a taut rope about to snap. Vitellius's face cycles through several expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and something that might be fear. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a forced joviality that fools no one. How interesting. And what does our esteemed colleague propose to do about this unauthorized usurpation of imperial prerogatives? The courier's response destroys any remaining illusions about the eastern province's intentions. Caesar, Governor Vespasian's armies are already marching west. General Antonius Primus commands the advance forces and has orders to secure the Alpine passes before winter. Governor Mucianus will follow with additional legions once arrangements are complete for governing Syria in his absence. This time, the silence is broken by nervous murmurs from the assembled courtiers. Everyone understands the implications. Vespasian isn't just claiming imperial titles, he's actively preparing to take them by force. More concerning still, he's moving with the kind of methodical planning that suggests this rebellion has been months in the making. That evening, as you make your way home through streets that suddenly feel less secure, you encounter evidence of how quickly confidence in Vitellius's regime is eroding. In taverns and shops, conversations die when strangers approach. Merchants begin converting their holdings to portable valuables. Wealthy families start making discreet inquiries about property in Gaul or Spain, places that might remain safe regardless of which emperor ultimately prevails. Perhaps most tellingly, you notice that the Praetorian Guards, those elite troops who killed Galba and then abandoned Otho, are beginning to look nervous again. They've backed 2 losing emperors already this year, and the prospect of having to choose sides in yet another civil war clearly weighs heavily on minds accustomed to ceremonial duties rather than life or death military campaigns. As autumn approaches and the first reports arrive of Flavian advance forces crossing into northern Italy, you realize with growing dread that the cycle of violence which began with Nero's death shows no signs of ending. Rome faces the prospect of its 3rd major battle in less than a year, fought between armies that should be defending the empire's frontiers against barbarian enemies rather than slaughtering each other for the privilege of wearing the purple. The year of the 4 emperors has entered its most dangerous phase, where the stakes couldn't be higher and the outcome remains terrifyingly uncertain. October brings the first bitter taste of winter to Rome, but the chill in the air seems mild compared to the ice-cold fear that has settled over the city as news from the north grows increasingly desperate. You've managed to secure a position in the imperial administration. Nothing important, just copying correspondence and maintaining records, but it provides you with unprecedented access to the man whose decisions will determine whether you live or die in the coming weeks. Vitellius is not the monster that his enemies describe, nor the noble ruler his supporters claim him to be. In the quiet moments between ceremonial appearances and military briefings, you observe a man caught between his own limitations and the impossible demands of imperial power. This morning you watch him in his private study, surrounded by maps of northern Italy, marked with coloured pins representing troop movements, his fingers drumming nervously on the marble desktop as he struggles to comprehend a situation that seems to be spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Explain it to me again," he says to his military advisor, Gaius Caecina Severus, his voice carrying the weary patience of someone who has asked this question many times before. How did Antonius Primus manage to get 3 legions across the Alps without anyone stopping him? Caecina, a veteran commander whose scars tell the story of 20 years fighting Germanic tribes, spreads a detailed map across the table. His explanation reveals the methodical brilliance of Vespasian's strategy and the fatal weaknesses in Vitellius's position. Caesar Primus didn't force his way across the mountains. He was invited. The garrison commanders at the key passes had already received letters from their colleagues in the eastern provinces, describing Vespasian's victories in Judea and his generous treatment of soldiers who joined his cause early. By the time our messengers reached them with orders to hold their positions, half the men had already switched sides. You watch Vitellius process this information. See the moment when he fully grasps that his empire is dissolving not through military defeat, but through calculated defection. His hands shake slightly as he reaches for a cup of wine, not the steady tremor of an old man, but the nervous quiver of someone whose comfortable assumptions about loyalty and authority have been shattered beyond repair. And what of Cremona? Vitellius asks, referring to the strategic city that controls the road between the Alpine passes and the Po Valley. Surely our garrison there remains faithful. The expression on Caecina's face provides the answer before he speaks. Caesar, we received a dispatch this morning. The city surrendered yesterday after a brief siege. Primus offered the defenders the same terms he's been extending everywhere: continued service at their current rank, bonuses for cooperation, no penalties for their previous loyalty to the legitimate government. The pause before those final words speaks volumes about how rapidly the definition of legitimacy is shifting. Even Vitellius's own commanders are beginning to hedge their language, preparing for the possibility that they may soon need to explain their service to a different emperor. But it's in the evening, during a private dinner with his family, that you see the human cost of imperial ambition most clearly. Through a partially open door, you observe Vitellius with his wife Galeria Fundana and their 2 young children. The emperor who projects confidence during public appearances becomes a worried father discussing whether to send his family to safety in Gaul. The children don't understand, Galeria says, her voice carrying the controlled desperation of a mother trying to protect what matters most. Germanicus keeps asking why we can't go back to our old house, why there are always soldiers around, why everyone looks so frightened when they speak to his father. Vitellius lifts his 7-year-old son onto his lap, and for a moment the emperor disappears, replaced by a man grappling with the knowledge that his political choices may cost his children their lives. What would you have me do? He asks his wife, though the question seems directed more to the gods than to her. Abdicate, flee, let Vespasian have the throne without a fight. Yes, she responds immediately, her maternal instincts overriding any concern for political dignity. Yes, absolutely. What is the purple worth if wearing it means our children die? What is imperial glory compared to watching them grow up safely in some distant province where no one cares about our past mistakes? But even as she speaks, you can see in Vitellius's expression that such a choice is impossible. Not because he's consumed by ambition or drunk on power, but because he's trapped by the logic of civil war. Emperors who abdicate don't retire to comfortable estates, they are killed to prevent future rebellions. Their families are eliminated to avoid providing rallying points for remaining loyalists. Once you claim the purple, the only exits are death or victory. The next morning brings news that makes the emperor's dilemma even more desperate. Marcus Antonius Primus has won another bloodless victory, this time capturing the vital road junction at Verona through a combination of bribery, negotiation, and carefully timed betrayal by local commanders. His advance continues with terrifying momentum, each success making the next one easier as Vitellius's remaining supporters calculate their options and find them increasingly limited. You accompany Vitellius to an emergency meeting with the Praetorian prefect, where the emperor attempts to shore up the loyalty of the troops who represent his final line of defense. But the conversation reveals how thoroughly the foundations of his power have eroded. Caesar, the prefect says carefully, the men are asking questions I find difficult to answer. They want to know why they should risk their lives fighting other Roman soldiers when those same soldiers are offering them better pay, better conditions and amnesty for past service. They've seen what happened to the legions that supported Otho. Most of them are now serving happily under Vitellius. Why shouldn't they expect similar treatment if they switch to Vespasian? It's a question that cuts to the heart of the crisis. When loyalty becomes a commodity to be bought rather than a bond to be honored, when soldiers view their allegiance as a business decision rather than a sacred duty, the entire imperial system becomes vulnerable to whoever can offer the most attractive terms. And Vespasian, with the wealth of Egypt and Syria behind him, can outbid any rival. That afternoon you witness what may be Vitellius's final attempt to retain control of his destiny. He drafts letters to provincial governors, offering increasingly desperate concessions, tax reductions, land grants, positions for their relatives, anything that might convince them to remain loyal. But you can see in his eyes that he knows these gestures are futile. The momentum has shifted too far, and in civil war, perception of inevitable victory becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. As evening falls over a Rome that feels increasingly like a city under siege, you understand that you're observing the final days of the third emperor in this terrible year. Vitellius isn't evil or incompetent. He's simply a man whose moderate talents are insufficient for the extraordinary crisis that has engulfed him. His tragedy isn't moral failure, but the gap between human limitations and historical forces too powerful for any individual to control. The decisive confrontation arrives not with the clash of armies that everyone expected, but with the kind of complex political maneuvering that demonstrates just how thoroughly the nature of Roman warfare has changed during this year of chaos. It's late October 69 AD, and you find yourself in the unusual position of witnessing history unfold from multiple perspectives as various factions within Rome itself begin to position themselves for the inevitable transition of power. The morning brings word that changes everything. Marcus Antonius Primus has won a crushing victory at the Second Battle of Bedriacum, the same location where Otho met his doom 6 months earlier. But this time the defeat is far more complete and devastating. Vitellius's best legions, led by General Caecina Severus, didn't just lose the battle. They switched sides in the middle of the fighting, turning what should have been a defense into a massacre of their former comrades. You're present in the imperial palace when the surviving messengers bring news of the catastrophe to Vitellius. The emperor receives the reports in his private audience chamber, surrounded by the handful of advisors who haven't yet found excuses to be elsewhere. The messenger, a young cavalry officer whose uniform is torn and blood-stained, delivers his account with the flat, emotionless tone of someone still in shock from what he's witnessed. Caesar, at dawn on the 24th day of October, our forces met the enemy near Bedriacum village. General Caecina had positioned the 21st Rapax and 5th Alaudae legions on the right wing, with auxiliary cohorts holding the center. Initially, the battle seemed to favor our cause. The Flavian left wing began to give ground under pressure from our cavalry. Vitellius leans forward in his chair, his face a mixture of hope and dread. What happened then? The messenger's voice breaks slightly as he continues. Caesar, at the crucial moment when victory seemed within our grasp, General Caecina raised a white banner and ordered his legions to lay down their arms. He had been negotiating with Antonius Primus for weeks, arranging terms for his defection. Our soldiers, seeing their commander's surrender, believed the battle was lost. Some tried to continue fighting, but most threw down their weapons and fled. The silence that follows is broken only by the sound of Vitellius's breathing, which has become labored and shallow. You watch him process the magnitude of this betrayal, not just the military defeat, but the realization that his most trusted general had been planning treachery for weeks while sitting at his council table and sharing his wine. How many? Vitellius asks quietly. Caesar, of the 30,000 men who marched north, perhaps 5,000 escaped the battlefield. The rest are dead, captured, or have joined Vespasian's forces. Antonius Primus is already marching south toward Rome with an army that grows larger every day as more units switch sides. But the true complexity of the situation reveals itself over the following days as Rome's various power centers begin their own negotiations with the approaching Flavians. You observe a remarkable ballet of political opportunism as senators, praetorian officers, and wealthy merchants compete to demonstrate their early support for Vespasian while maintaining enough deniability to survive if the situation somehow reverses. The Senate convenes in emergency session and you manage to position yourself in the gallery where you can observe the proceedings. What you witness is a masterclass in political survival as Rome's most distinguished citizens perform the delicate task of abandoning one emperor while embracing another without appearing treacherous to either. Senator Gaius Licinius Mosianus, not the Syrian governor of the same name, but his cousin who has lived quietly in Rome throughout the crisis, rises to address the chamber. His words are carefully chosen to provide maximum flexibility regardless of how events unfold. Honored colleagues, he begins, his voice carrying the authority of advanced age and inherited dignity. We face a moment that demands wisdom rather than passion, prudence rather than loyalty to failing causes. The eastern provinces have spoken clearly about their preferences for imperial leadership. Perhaps it is time we considered whether the divine will of the gods might be expressing itself through recent military developments. It's a brilliant speech that manages to endorse Vespasian while never explicitly criticizing Vitellius, that presents abandoning the current emperor as religious duty rather than political betrayal. The murmurs of approval from the assembled senators suggest that most are eager to embrace any justification for switching sides that preserves their dignity. Meanwhile, in the Praetorian camp you witness an even more complex negotiation as the guards' officers attempt to secure favorable terms for their inevitable surrender. These men have already backed 3 different emperors this year, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, and they're acutely aware that their reputation for loyalty has been permanently compromised. Prefect Sabinus meets with representatives from Antonius Primus, and their conversation reveals the cold pragmatism that now governs Roman politics. Through a contact in the administration, you learn the substance of their discussions. General Primus, Sabinus reportedly said, "My men are prepared to open the gates of Rome to Vespasian's forces, but we require assurances about our future service. We've seen what happens to losing armies in civil wars. Sometimes they're absorbed into the victor's forces, sometimes they're disbanded in disgrace, sometimes they're executed as traitors." Primus's response demonstrates the methodical approach that has made Vespasian's campaign so successful. Prefect Emperor Vespasian values experienced soldiers regardless of their previous loyalties. Those who facilitate a peaceful transition will find their service rewarded. Those who resist unnecessarily will face the consequences of their choices. But perhaps the most revealing conversations occur among Rome's wealthy merchant class, as business leaders calculate how to protect their investments during the coming political transition. You attend a private gathering hosted by Lucius Crassus Dives, a shipping magnate whose warehouses line the Tiber, where the discussion focuses entirely on practical survival strategies. The key, explains Marcus Junius Silanus, whose family trades in luxury goods from Asia, is to position ourselves as neutral facilitators rather than partisan supporters. We provide services that any emperor needs: ships, supplies, financial connections. Our loyalty is to Rome's prosperity, not to individual rulers who come and go. Another merchant, whose name you don't catch, adds a darker perspective. That strategy worked when transitions were occasional events handled through legal succession. But if we're entering an era where armies decide imperial succession every few months, neutrality becomes impossible. Eventually, everyone will be forced to choose sides based on who can best protect their interests. As October draws to a close, with Antonius Primus's forces approaching the outskirts of Rome, you realize you're witnessing the final collapse of any distinction between military conquest and political evolution. The approaching Flavians aren't just another army. They're a coalition of interests that has already absorbed much of Vitellius's support structure through negotiation rather than battle. The stage is set for Rome's final confrontation of this bloody year, but it will be decided as much by political calculation as by military force. December 20th, 69 AD dawns cold and grey over Rome, but the chill in the air seems insignificant compared to the ice-cold dread that has settled over the city as the final act of this year's tragedy unfolds. You wake to the sound of distant fighting, not the organized clash of armies meeting in open battle, but the chaotic, brutal noise of urban warfare as Flavian forces fight their way through the streets toward the Palatine Hill where Vitellius has made his final stand. The end comes with shocking swiftness after months of gradual political collapse. Antonius Primus's army entered Rome 3 days ago, through gates opened by Praetorian guards, who had negotiated their own surrender weeks in advance. What followed wasn't conquest, but a methodical occupation, as Flavian troops secured key buildings, arrested remaining Vitellian loyalists, and began the complex process of transitioning power to their absent emperor, who remains in Egypt, still technically fighting the Jewish rebellion. You witness the final moments of Vitellius's reign from a hiding place near the Forum, where crowds have gathered despite the danger to watch history unfold. The deposed emperor, abandoned by his bodyguards and rejected by his own family, has spent the morning wandering through the empty halls of the palace, like a ghost haunting his former life. His wife and children fled the city days ago, joining the stream of refugees heading for the ports of Campania, where ships wait to carry them to uncertain exile in distant provinces. The capture happens with an almost anticlimactic brutality that seems to encapsulate everything that has gone wrong with Roman civilization this year. A patrol of Flavian soldiers, led by a Germanic auxiliary whose tribal tattoos mark him as one of Vespasian's foreign mercenaries, finds Vitellius hiding in a servant's quarters of the palace, dressed in common clothes and clutching a bag of gold coins, the last pathetic remnant of imperial dignity. "Are you the emperor?" the auxiliary commander asks in broken Latin, his tone suggesting he's not entirely sure what an emperor should look like when stripped of purple robes and golden regalia. Vitellius, his face streaked with tears and dirt, nods weakly. I am, I don't know any more. What does it matter? What follows is a scene of such degrading cruelty that it seems designed to obliterate not just Vitellius personally, but the entire concept of imperial majesty. The soldiers bind his hands behind his back with common rope, place a noose around his neck like a common criminal, and begin dragging him through the streets of Rome toward the Forum where crowds are gathering to witness his humiliation. You follow this grim procession, horrified but unable to look away as the man who ruled the known world just hours earlier is subjected to the kind of treatment usually reserved for captured barbarian chieftains. Citizens throw garbage and stones, shouting curses and accusations about the civil war's destruction. Children run alongside the soldiers, laughing and pointing at this pathetic figure who represents everything they've been taught to fear about political chaos. But perhaps most disturbing is the speed with which former supporters transform themselves into enthusiastic participants in Vitellius's degradation. You recognize faces from the imperial court, men who had bowed deeply and spoken of eternal loyalty just weeks earlier, now competing to demonstrate their hatred for the fallen emperor. One former advisor actually spits on Vitellius as he's dragged past, shouting about how he had always secretly supported Vespasian. The execution takes place on the Gemonian steps, that traditional site of Roman state justice where enemies of the people have been strangled for centuries. But there's nothing traditional or dignified about what happens to Vitellius. The soldiers don't simply kill him, they torture him first, cutting his flesh with small knives, pulling out his hair, forcing him to watch as they destroy portraits and statues bearing his likeness. When death finally comes, it's almost a mercy. They strangle him with the rope they've used to drag him through the streets, then throw his body into the Tiber like refuse. The entire process from capture to disposal takes less than 3 hours. An emperor who once commanded legions and governed provinces dies like a common thief, unmourned and unremembered except as a cautionary tale about the price of political failure. The immediate aftermath reveals how completely Rome has adapted to this new reality of imperial transition through violence. Before Vitellius's body has even been thrown in the river, Flavian officials are already distributing proclamations announcing Vespasian's accession to power. The Senate convenes in emergency session to formally ratify what military force has already decided, passing resolutions that grant Vespasian all the traditional imperial powers and privileges. You attend this Senate meeting and observe the remarkable speed with which legal fiction transforms accomplished facts into legitimate authority. The same senators who had acclaimed Galba, Otho, and Vitellius now compete to demonstrate their early recognition of Vespasian's obvious qualifications for imperial rule. Citizens declares the presiding consul, his voice echoing through the marble chamber, "We gather today not to mourn the end of disorder, but to celebrate the restoration of proper governance. The gods have clearly indicated their preference for leadership that combines military excellence with administrative competence. Emperor Vespasian represents the answer to our prayers for stability and prosperity." The irony is breathtaking. This divine preference was expressed through 18 months of civil war that killed tens of thousands of Roman soldiers and devastated half of Italy. But nobody mentions these inconvenient details as the Senate rushes to embrace the new reality. Within hours of the formal ratification, the machinery of imperial government resumes operation under new management. Flavian officials begin issuing decrees, appointing governors and reorganizing military commands. The Praetorian Guard is disbanded and replaced with troops loyal to the new regime. Treasury officials start calculating how to pay the bonuses promised to soldiers who supported the winning side. Most remarkably, ordinary life in Rome continues with barely a pause. The markets reopen, the baths resume normal operations, and citizens go about their business as if the violent death of an emperor is simply another routine transition in the complex mechanics of imperial administration. You observe people buying bread, conducting business, planning for the approaching Saturnalia celebrations, the normal rhythms of urban existence reasserting themselves within hours of witnessing unprecedented brutality. That evening, as you walk home through streets that already feel different under Flavian occupation, you reflect on what you've witnessed. 3 emperors have died this year: Galba by assassination, Otho by suicide, Vitellius by execution. Yet the Roman Empire continues, its institutions adapting to each new ruler, its citizens adjusting their loyalties as circumstances require. The year of the 4 emperors has ended, but the precedent it established, that military force determines imperial succession, will echo through the centuries to come, making the empire permanently vulnerable to ambitious generals who believe they deserve to wear the purple. The months following Vitellius's death blur together in a cascade of rapid changes that transform not just Rome's government, but the entire character of imperial rule. You find yourself caught in the whirlwind of transition, as Vespasian's representatives work with methodical efficiency to consolidate power, reward supporters, and eliminate potential threats to the new regime. What emerges from this process is not merely a change of emperors, but a fundamental shift in how the Roman Empire understands itself and its relationship to military power. By February 70 AD, Vespasian himself finally arrives in Rome, having delegated the final stages of the Jewish rebellion to his son Titus. You're among the crowds that line the Via Appia to witness the new emperor's entry into his capital, and the contrast with previous imperial arrivals is immediately apparent. Where Galba had emphasized his stern discipline and Vitellius had showcased his military might, Vespasian presents himself as a practical administrator coming to repair damage rather than a conquering hero claiming his prize. The man you observe riding through Rome's gates is neither young nor charismatic. In his 60s, with a weathered face and the slightly stooped posture of someone more comfortable in a military camp than on a ceremonial platform, Vespasian looks like what he is: a provincial general who has spent decades managing difficult problems in unglamorous locations. Yet there's something reassuring about his very ordinariness. A sense that here finally is an emperor who might be more interested in governing than in glorifying himself. His first major speech to the Roman people, delivered from the traditional platform in the Forum, sets the tone for everything that follows. Unlike the flowery rhetoric and grand promises that had characterized his predecessor's public appearances, Vespasian speaks with the blunt directness of a man who has spent his career dealing with practical problems rather than political theory. "Citizens of Rome," he begins, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, but without the theatrical projection that marked earlier emperors' oratory. "I come before you not as a conqueror but as a builder. This empire has been damaged by 18 months of civil war. Cities have been burned, legions destroyed, treasuries emptied, and confidence shattered. My task, our task, is to repair what has been broken and ensure that such devastation never occurs again." The crowd's response is notably subdued, not the wild enthusiasm that had greeted some of his predecessors, but something more valuable: attentive respect. These people have witnessed too much false hope and empty promise to be easily impressed by grand rhetoric. They want evidence of competence, not displays of charisma. That evidence comes quickly through a series of administrative reforms that reveal Vespasian's understanding of the empire's fundamental problems. Within weeks of his arrival, he begins restructuring the Praetorian Guard to prevent future coups, reorganizing provincial commands to reduce the likelihood of successful rebellions, and most importantly, addressing the financial crisis that the civil wars have created. You witness the impact of these changes in your daily life as a Roman citizen. The grain supply, disrupted for months by political chaos, stabilizes as Egyptian shipments resume under competent management. Public works projects that had been abandoned during the fighting restart with proper funding and oversight. Most remarkably, the constant atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that had characterized life under the previous emperors begins to dissipate. But perhaps the most significant change is one that takes longer to recognize: the emergence of dynastic thinking in imperial succession. Unlike his predecessors who had ruled as individuals with unclear plans for the future, Vespasian immediately begins preparing his sons Titus and Domitian to eventually succeed him. It's a radical departure from the fiction of republican restoration that had characterized earlier emperors, an open acknowledgement that the Principate has become a permanent monarchy. The year 70 AD brings the dramatic conclusion of the Jewish rebellion when Titus finally captures Jerusalem after a siege that devastates the ancient city. You're present in Rome when news of the victory arrives, accompanied by the announcement that the sacred treasures of the temple will be displayed in a triumphal procession through the capital. The symbolism is profound, not just the defeat of a rebellious province, but the demonstration that the Flavian dynasty has divine approval for its rule. The triumph itself, held in the autumn of 71 AD, represents everything that Vespasian wants his reign to symbolize. Unlike the hasty defensive pageantry that had marked his predecessors' ceremonies, this is a carefully orchestrated demonstration of restored imperial competence. You watch from the crowds as captured Jewish leaders are paraded through the streets, followed by the golden artifacts from the temple, including the great seven-branched candelabrum that will become one of the most famous symbols of Roman victory. But more important than the spectacle itself is what it represents: the end of the crisis period that began with Nero's death. The empire has survived its near dissolution, emerging with new institutions, new leadership, and a new understanding of the relationship between military power and political authority. The construction projects that begin during Vespasian's reign provide the most visible symbols of this recovery. The decision to build what will become known as the Colosseum on the site of Nero's despised Golden House sends a clear message about the new regime's priorities: public entertainment rather than imperial luxury, practical magnificence rather than personal indulgence. You observe the early stages of this construction with fascination, watching as teams of workers clear away the remnants of Nero's excess and begin laying foundations for what will become the most famous amphitheater in history. The project employs thousands of Roman citizens, provides training for skilled craftsmen, and creates a visible symbol of the empire's renewed confidence in its future. By 75 AD, the transformation is complete. Rome has evolved from a city traumatized by civil war into the stable capital of a restored empire. The institutions that Vespasian has created, professional administration, dynastic succession, financial responsibility, will provide the foundation for nearly 3 centuries of imperial stability. The year of the 4 emperors has become history, remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when military ambition overwhelms political wisdom, but no longer a present threat to imperial stability. Yet as you reflect on these changes from the perspective of several years' distance, you understand that the fundamental lesson of 69 AD has been absorbed rather than rejected. Vespasian rules not because of birth or adoption or Senate approval, but because he commanded the loyalty of enough legions to defeat his rivals. The precedent established during the year of the 4 emperors, that military force ultimately determines imperial succession, remains unchanged, simply held in abeyance by competent leadership and fortunate circumstances. 10 years have passed since Vitellius died on the Gemonian steppes, and you now find yourself in a Roman Empire that would be barely recognizable to someone who had lived through the chaos of 69 AD. The transformation has been so complete, so methodical, that it's easy to forget just how close civilization came to complete collapse during that terrible year when 4 men claimed the purple and 3 of them died violent deaths in pursuit of it. Walking through the Forum on a warm spring morning in 79 AD, you observe the physical manifestations of this new stability everywhere. The construction of the Flavian amphitheatre is nearing completion, its massive arches and corridors representing not just architectural ambition but a fundamental shift in how emperors relate to their subjects. Where Nero built a golden palace for his private pleasure, Vespasian has created a venue where 50,000 Romans can gather to watch spectacles funded by imperial generosity. But the changes run far deeper than impressive buildings and public entertainments. The entire structure of Roman government has been reformed in ways that address the fundamental weaknesses that led to the crisis of the four emperors. You've witnessed this transformation from within, having secured a position as a clerk in the imperial bureaucracy where you process the endless stream of documents that keep the empire functioning. The most significant change is the professionalization of imperial administration. Under the Julio-Claudian dynasty, government positions were often filled by freedmen and clients who owed their advancement to personal connections rather than competence. The result was an administration that reflected the emperor's character rather than the empire's needs. Efficient under Augustus, chaotic under Caligula, competent but paranoid under Claudius, and increasingly corrupt under Nero. Vespasian has systematically replaced this personal system with something approaching a professional civil service. You work alongside men who have been selected for their skills rather than their family connections, who serve the imperial office rather than the individual emperor, and who understand that their careers depend on institutional competence rather than personal favor. It's a revolution disguised as reform, creating a government apparatus that can function regardless of who happens to wear the purple. The military reforms are equally comprehensive and far more directly related to the lessons learned during the year of the four emperors. The old system where provincial governors commanded legions stationed in their territories for years at a time created the very conditions that allowed ambitious generals to build personal loyalty among their troops and use those armies to march on Rome. Under the new arrangements, you observe a careful separation of civil and military authority. Provincial governors now focus on administration, taxation, and justice, while military commanders handle purely martial concerns. More importantly, these commanders are rotated frequently to prevent the development of dangerous personal relationships between generals and their legions. The Praetorian Guard, whose repeated betrayals of emperors throughout 69 AD demonstrated the dangers of relying on elite troops stationed in the capital, has been completely reconstituted. The new guard is recruited from legions throughout the empire rather than from Italian communities, and its commanders are chosen for loyalty to the Flavian dynasty rather than connections to the Roman aristocracy. Perhaps most tellingly, Vespasian has addressed the succession problem that triggered the entire crisis. Rather than maintaining the fiction that the Principate is a temporary magistracy that might somehow be restored to the Senate and people of Rome, he has openly established a dynasty. His sons Titus and Domitian hold important positions in government and military, gaining the experience they will need to rule competently when their time comes. You witness the practical impact of this dynastic planning during a ceremony in 78 AD when Vespasian formally designates Titus as his successor. The event takes place not in the Senate House with all the republican trappings that earlier emperors had maintained, but in the imperial palace before an audience of military commanders, provincial governors, and administrative officials. Citizens and soldiers, Vespasian announces, his weathered voice carrying the authority of a decade of successful rule. The strength of our empire depends not on the brilliance of individual leaders, but on the continuity of competent governance. When the gods call me to join my ancestors, Titus will continue the work we have begun together. There will be no doubt about succession, no competition among rivals, no opportunity for ambitious men to tear the empire apart in pursuit of personal glory. The applause that follows is respectful but not enthusiastic. These people have learned to value stability over charisma, competence over charm. They understand that boring government is good government, that the excitement of civil war is a luxury no civilization can afford. The economic policies implemented during Vespasian's reign reflect the same practical approach. The imperial finances, devastated by Nero's extravagance and the civil war's disruption, have been restored through careful management rather than increased taxation. You observe this recovery in your daily work as financial reports cross your desk showing steady growth in provincial revenues, successful completion of public works projects, and gradual reduction in the debt accumulated during the crisis years. Most importantly for the empire's long-term stability, Vespasian has successfully integrated the provincial elites who supported his rise to power. Unlike previous emperors who relied primarily on Italian aristocrats, the Flavian administration includes senators and equites from Gaul, Spain, and the eastern provinces. The empire is becoming less Roman and more imperial, drawing its leadership from the entire Mediterranean world rather than just the Italian peninsula. This inclusivity extends to military commands as well. You've processed appointment documents that show provincial auxiliaries being promoted to positions previously reserved for Roman citizens, Germanic chieftains receiving Roman citizenship and military commissions, and Eastern merchants being granted the tax farming contracts that generate much of the empire's revenue. The cultural changes are perhaps the most subtle but ultimately the most significant. The Roman elite has learned to think of imperial succession as a practical problem to be solved rather than a political opportunity to be exploited. The Senate, which had oscillated between servile submission and dangerous ambition during the crisis year, has found a comfortable middle ground as a deliberative body that advises rather than challenges imperial policy. You observe this new relationship during Senate meetings where debates focus on technical questions of administration rather than fundamental issues of policy. Senators discuss tax rates, infrastructure projects, and judicial procedures with the expertise of experienced administrators rather than the rhetoric of political competitors. It's not the golden age of Republican oratory that nostalgic conservatives sometimes remember, but it's stable and effective in ways that the old system never was. As you walk home through streets that bustle with commerce and construction, you reflect on how completely the trauma of 69 AD has been transformed into the foundation of a new kind of imperial stability. The Roman Empire has survived its greatest crisis not by returning to some imagined golden age of the past, but by evolving into something more realistic, more professional, and ultimately more durable than what came before. June 79 AD arrives with devastating news that reminds you how quickly stability can be shattered by forces beyond human control. Emperor Vespasian, the man who restored order from chaos and rebuilt the empire on firmer foundations, dies peacefully in his bed at his family estate in the Sabine Hills. His final words, reported by those present, capture both his practical nature and his understanding of imperial mortality. Ve, puto deus fio, alas, I think I'm becoming a god. The transition to Titus proceeds exactly as planned, without the violence, uncertainty, or political maneuvering that had characterized every imperial succession since Augustus. You observe this remarkable achievement from your position in the bureaucracy, watching as power transfers seamlessly from father to son through institutions that have been carefully designed to prevent the chaos that destroyed 3 emperors in a single year just a decade earlier. Yet even as you witness this triumph of systematic governance, you cannot escape the awareness that the fundamental lesson of 69 AD remains unresolved. The Roman Empire has not found a way to legitimize imperial power beyond military force. It has simply created more efficient ways to manage that force and more sophisticated methods to prevent its misuse. Vespasian ruled because he commanded more legions than his rivals, and Titus now rules because he has inherited control of those same legions along with the bureaucratic apparatus his father built to support them. The implications of this inheritance become clearer as the years pass, and you observe the empire's continued evolution under the Flavian dynasty. When Titus dies unexpectedly in 81 AD, after a reign of barely 2 years, power passes to his younger brother Domitian, with the same institutional efficiency that had marked his own accession. The machinery of succession works flawlessly, but its success depends entirely on the cooperation of the military commanders who could, if they chose, repeat the pattern established by Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. From your perspective as a government clerk with access to provincial correspondence, you observe how the empire's administrators have learned to navigate this fundamental tension. Provincial governors write careful reports that demonstrate their competence without appearing to build independent power bases. Military commanders rotate through assignments that prevent them from developing dangerous loyalty among their troops. Senators debate policy within boundaries that everyone understands but no one discusses openly. It's a delicate balance that depends on continued prosperity, successful military campaigns against external enemies, and the good judgment of individual emperors. When any of these elements falters, the precedent established during the year of the 4 emperors remains available to ambitious men who believe they can do better than the current occupant of the throne. You witness the fragility of this arrangement during the later years of Domitian's reign, as the emperor becomes increasingly suspicious of potential rivals and begins executing senators and generals on charges of treason that grow progressively thinner. The Senate's response is not open rebellion. The memory of civil war remains too fresh for that, but a kind of sullen compliance that everyone recognizes as unsustainable in the long term. The resolution comes in 96 AD, when Domitian is assassinated by a conspiracy that includes his own Praetorian prefect, demonstrating that even the reforms implemented after 69 AD cannot completely eliminate the possibility of violent succession. Yet the aftermath reveals how much the empire has learned from its earlier crisis. Rather than triggering another round of civil wars, Domitian's death leads to the careful selection of Nerva, an elderly senator who represents stability and continuity rather than personal ambition. More importantly, Nerva almost immediately adopts Trajan, a successful general from Spain, as his successor. This adoption creates a new model for imperial succession that combines the legitimacy of legal inheritance with the practical requirement of military competence. It's a brilliant solution to the problem that destroyed the Julio-Claudian dynasty and nearly wrecked the empire during the year of the 4 emperors. Under this new system, which will govern imperial succession for nearly a century, emperors choose their successors based on merit rather than blood relationship, but formalize those choices through legal adoption that provides constitutional legitimacy. The result is a series of rulers: Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who combine personal competence with institutional authority in ways that prevent both the chaos of civil war and the stagnation of incompetent hereditary succession. Yet even as you observe the success of this adoptive system during the reigns of what later historians will call the good emperors, you understand that it represents an evolution of the patterns established in 69 AD, rather than a complete departure from them. Trajan rules because he commands the loyalty of the legions stationed along the Danube and Rhine frontiers. Hadrian maintains power by traveling constantly throughout the empire, personally inspecting troops and fortifications. Antoninus Pius governs effectively because potential rivals understand that challenging him would require military resources they cannot match. The fundamental truth revealed during the year of the 4 emperors, that imperial power ultimately rests on the loyalty of armed men rather than constitutional law, remains unchanged beneath the sophisticated administrative structures and legal fictions that subsequent emperors have constructed to manage it. This reality becomes brutally apparent when the adoptive system finally breaks down in the late 2nd century. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps influenced by natural affection or political pressure, designates his biological son Commodus as his successor, rather than adopting a more qualified candidate. The result is a gradual return to the conditions that produced the crisis of 69 AD, an incompetent emperor, growing military dissatisfaction, and ambitious generals calculating their chances of successful rebellion. When Commodus is finally assassinated in 192 AD, the empire immediately plunges into another period of civil war that consciously echoes the events you witnessed more than a century earlier. Pertinax, the elderly senator chosen as Commodus's successor, is killed by the Praetorian Guard after 3 months. Didius Julianus literally purchases the throne from the guards, only to be overthrown by Septimius Severus, a general who marches on Rome with his legions exactly as Vespasian had done. The cycle repeats itself with minor variations, demonstrating that the year of the 4 emperors established a permanent template for imperial succession crises. Whenever the normal mechanisms of power transfer break down, ambitious generals resort to the precedent established by Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. Gather enough military support to make your claim credible, then march on Rome and eliminate your rivals. From your perspective as someone who lived through the original crisis, the most striking aspect of these later civil wars is how closely they follow the patterns established in 69 AD. Provincial armies proclaim their commanders as emperor, existing loyalties dissolve as soldiers calculate which side offers better prospects, and political legitimacy becomes a commodity to be purchased with promises of bonuses and promotions. The Roman Empire has learned to manage these crises more efficiently, but it has never solved the fundamental problem they represent: how to create legitimate succession in a system where ultimate authority depends on control of military force rather than constitutional law or popular consent. As an old man now, sitting in the same garden where you once worried about choosing sides between Otho and Vitellius, you find yourself reflecting on the deeper lessons that emerge from your lifetime of witnessing how power transfers from one ruler to another in the Roman world. The olive trees around you have grown thick and gnarled over the decades, much like your understanding of the forces that shape human civilization when ordinary legal and social constraints break down under extreme pressure. The most profound realization that comes with age and experience is how the year of the 4 emperors revealed the essentially fragile nature of all political systems, regardless of how permanent and stable they appear to their contemporaries. The Roman Empire in 68 AD seemed as eternal and inevitable as the mountains or the sea. It had existed for nearly a century under the Julio-Claudian dynasty, had conquered most of the known world, and had created institutions that appeared capable of governing indefinitely. Yet within 18 months this supposedly invincible system had nearly destroyed itself through internal contradictions that nobody had recognized or anticipated. The problem wasn't moral decay or barbarian invasions or economic collapse, the traditional explanations that historians offer for imperial decline. The problem was structural. The Romans had created a system of government that depended on personal loyalty and informal relationships rather than institutional checks and balances. When Nero died without a clear successor, the carefully maintained fiction that the emperor was merely the first citizen of a restored republic collapsed overnight. The reality that imperial power rested on military force rather than constitutional authority became impossible to ignore when 4 different generals decided they deserved to wear the purple and were willing to fight civil wars to claim it. What strikes you most powerfully as you reflect on these events is how rational and understandable the actions of all the participants appear when viewed from their individual perspectives. Galba didn't march on Rome because he was consumed by evil ambition. He responded to a genuine invitation from the Senate to save the empire from Nero's misrule. Otho didn't murder Galba out of bloodthirsty malice. He eliminated a ruler who had proven incapable of governing effectively, and who posed a continuing threat to political stability. Even Vitellius, perhaps the most reluctant of the four emperors, found himself trapped by circumstances beyond his control. When his legions proclaimed him emperor, refusing probably meant death for himself and his family. When Vespasian challenged his authority, backing down would have accomplished nothing, except ensuring that someone else would wear the purple he had been forced to claim. And Vespasian, the ultimate victor, wasn't driven by megalomaniacal dreams of world conquest. He saw an empire collapsing into chaos under incompetent leadership, and concluded that he could do better, a judgment that subsequent events proved largely correct. His rebellion succeeded not because he was more ruthless than his rivals, but because he was more competent at the complex tasks of coalition building, resource management, and strategic planning that imperial rule required. This pattern of rational individual decisions producing irrational collective outcomes represents one of the fundamental tragedies of human political organization. Each participant in the crisis acted according to reasonable calculations of self-interest and public benefit. Yet the cumulative result was a disaster that nearly destroyed the civilization they were all trying to preserve. The lesson extends beyond the specifics of Roman history to the universal problem of how societies manage transitions of power when normal legal mechanisms prove inadequate. Every political system faces moments when existing institutions cannot resolve fundamental disagreements about who should rule and how power should be exercised. At such moments, the underlying reality that all government ultimately depends on the consent of armed men becomes impossible to disguise behind legal fictions and constitutional procedures. What you learned by living through 69 AD is that such crises reveal character rather than creating it. The Romans who collaborated with each successive emperor weren't moral cowards. They were practical people trying to preserve their families and communities in circumstances where principled resistance would have accomplished nothing except their own destruction. The soldiers who switched sides repeatedly weren't traitors. They were professionals making business decisions about which employer offered better terms for their services. Even the emperors themselves, with the possible exception of Otho's final gesture of suicide to end the civil war, behaved in ways that made sense from their individual standpoints. The tragedy lies not in their personal failures, but in the structural contradictions of a system that could only resolve succession disputes through violence. This understanding has shaped your perspective on the subsequent developments you've witnessed during your long life. The adoptive emperors who followed the Flavians succeeded not because they solved the fundamental problem of imperial succession, but because they managed it more skillfully. Their system worked as long as emperors chose competent successors, and those successors commanded sufficient military support to discourage potential rivals. But when Marcus Aurelius designated his incompetent son Commodus as heir rather than adopting a more qualified candidate, the same structural problems that destroyed the Julio-Claudian dynasty reasserted themselves. The result was another round of civil wars that followed precisely the template established in 69 AD, military commanders with provincial armies challenging imperial authority when they concluded they could govern more effectively than the current occupant of the throne. The pattern will likely repeat itself indefinitely, you realize, because no political system has yet discovered how to legitimize supreme power in ways that don't ultimately depend on force or the threat of force. Constitutional law, divine right, popular consent, hereditary succession, All of these are simply different methods for disguising the basic reality that rulers rule because they can compel obedience from enough people to maintain their authority. The Year of the Four Emperors stripped away these comfortable illusions and revealed the naked mechanics of political power in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. But perhaps that discomfort served a useful purpose by forcing subsequent generations of Romans to think more realistically about the requirements of stable government and the price of political failure. As the evening sun casts long shadows across your garden, you understand that the ultimate lesson of your experience isn't despair about human nature or cynicism about political institutions. Instead, it's a deeper appreciation for the complex balance of forces that makes civilized life possible, and the constant vigilance required to maintain that balance when ambitious individuals discover that the normal constraints on their behavior have temporarily disappeared. The stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky above Rome as you conclude your long reflection on the year that changed everything. From your garden, you can see the lights flickering in windows across the city, each one representing a family going about the ordinary business of human life, preparing evening meals, telling stories to children, discussing plans for tomorrow. It's a peaceful scene that would have seemed impossible during those terrible months when the empire nearly tore itself apart. Yet you know now, with the wisdom that comes from witnessing the full cycle of destruction and renewal, that this tranquility is both precious and fragile. The Roman Empire survived the Year of the Four Emperors not because it was destined to endure, but because ordinary people like yourself made countless small decisions to preserve what they valued rather than surrender to despair or embrace chaos. The merchants who kept their shops open despite the uncertainty, the farmers who planted their crops not knowing which emperor would tax the harvest, the soldiers who eventually chose competence over personal loyalty, all of these individual acts of faith in the future helped carry civilization through its darkest moment. History is shaped not just by the great figures who claim crowns and lead armies, but by the millions of anonymous citizens who choose cooperation over conflict, hope over fear, tomorrow over today. As you settle back into your comfortable chair and pull a woolen cloak around your shoulders against the cooling air, you find a strange comfort in this understanding. The Year of the Four Emperors taught you that no system of government is permanent, that all human institutions are vulnerable to the passions and ambitions of the people who operate them. But it also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of human civilization, its capacity to adapt and rebuild even after experiencing trauma that seemed certain to destroy everything. The olive trees in your garden have witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, the coming and going of armies, the endless cycle of human ambition and disappointment. Yet they continue to put forth their leaves each spring, to offer their shade each summer, to produce their fruit each autumn. There's a lesson in their patient endurance, a reminder that the deepest truths about life lie not in the dramatic moments that captivate historians, but in the quiet persistence of ordinary existence. The empire that emerges from the darkness beyond your garden walls is not the same Rome that existed before Nero's death. It's more professional, more realistic about the sources of political power, more careful about the mechanisms of succession. But it's still Rome, still the center of a civilization that spans 3 continents, still home to the dreams and fears of millions of people who have learned to live with uncertainty while hoping for stability. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that survival doesn't require perfection, only the willingness to learn from disaster, and the wisdom to value what endures over what merely glitters. The purple cloaks and golden laurel wreaths that seemed so important to Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian have crumbled to dust, but the roads they built, the laws they administered, and the peace they ultimately restored continue to benefit people whose names will never be recorded in any history. As your eyes grow heavy and the sounds of the city fade into the gentle murmur of night, you drift towards sleep with the knowledge that you have witnessed one of history's great turning points and lived to understand its meaning. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new uncertainties, perhaps even new crises that will test the strength of the institutions built from the ashes of that terrible year. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of your garden, surrounded by the patient olive trees and watched over by the eternal stars, you rest in the peace that comes from having seen the worst that human ambition can inflict, and the best that human resilience can achieve. The year of the four emperors is history now, its lessons absorbed into the bloodstream of civilization, its warnings preserved for future generations who will face their own moments of testing. Sleep comes gently, carrying you back through the decades to that young merchant who once stood in the forum wondering which emperor deserved his loyalty, and forward into dreams where the olive trees whisper ancient wisdom about the endless dance of change and continuity that shapes all human experience. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter